My son introduced me to his boss as the help. He said it in a room with about 60 people in it. He put his hand out toward me, the way you point at a piece of furniture, and he said, "Oh, that is just the help." He did our half-act. And everybody laughed. I laughed too. That belongs at the front of this, because there is no version where I stood up. I stood there in a clean shirt, with a beer I was not drinking, and I laughed at a joke my son made about me, and then that room went back to what it was doing. There were 4 people in that building who knew who I actually was, and not one of them was in that room. I raised that boy by myself from the day he was born. His mother died 90 minutes after he came, and I never remarried, and I paid for his college and his business school and the down payment on his home. He introduced me to his boss as the help. Somebody tell me in the comments what you would have done standing there. I did nothing. I did nothing for 4 months, and then I did one thing, and I have never once regretted it, and I have also not slept right since. Subscribe while you are down there. I put one of these up every day. Hit like on your way past. My name is Calder Ashworth, and I am 64 years old. I am a plumber. That is the whole answer, and it has never embarrassed me one day in my life. Master license in the state of Georgia since 1988. I started as an apprentice at 19 for a man named Ozzie Pruitt Hale, who paid me $4 an hour and taught me everything, and I came up through service work, and then commercial, and then mechanical, and in 1994 I started a company with 2 vans and a phone in a rented office in Doraville. Ashworth Mechanical, plumbing, HVAC, process piping, commercial and institutional, mostly, schools, hospitals, distribution centers, and eventually the big residential towers that started going up all over the north side of Atlanta after about 2005. By the time I was 55, there were 211 people on that payroll. I sold it in 2022 when I was 61. Not all of it. That is going to matter enormously in about 40 minutes, so I am going to be exact. I sold 60% to a private equity group out of Charlotte. I kept 40%, and I kept a seat on the board of directors, and I kept the right to vote on any subcontract or master service agreement over $1 million annually. I negotiated that last part myself, over the objection of my own attorney, because I did not want to wake up one day and find out my name was on work I would not have taken. There are 5 people on that board, and I am one of them. The chief executive is a woman named Persimmon Ives Barclay, who came out of a Charlotte firm and who I fought with for about a year and now trust completely. Nobody outside that boardroom knows any of this. I do not have a title on a website. My name is not on the trucks anymore because the group rebranded in 2023. I go into the office on Buford Highway maybe twice a month, and I park in the lot like everybody else, and I wear the same clothes I have worn since 1988, which is a pressed work shirt and boots, because I have never in my life owned a suit that did not have a funeral attached to it. People decide what I am inside of about 4 seconds, and I have let them do it for 40 years, and it has cost me nothing until it cost me my son. Now I have to tell you about Marisol. Her name was Marisol Ashworth, and we were married in 1989, and she died on the 9th of April, 1991, in a hospital in Decatur, about 90 minutes after our son was born. Amniotic fluid embolism. If you have not heard of it, you are not alone. It is rare, and there is nothing anybody did wrong, and there is nothing anybody could have done, and I have been told that by 4 different doctors across 34 years, and I have never fully accepted it. She was 27, I was 30. 11 seconds of that day, and then I will leave it alone, because it is the reason for every single thing that came after, and if I skip it, none of this makes sense. They had already given me the baby. That is the thing. Somebody had put a wrapped-up child in my arms in a hallway and told me my wife was having a complication, and I stood in that hallway holding my son for about 11 minutes before a woman came out and told me. I was holding him when I found out. I have thought about the fact that the first 11 minutes of my son's life and the last 11 minutes of my wife's were the same 11 minutes, and that I spent them all in a hallway on the 2nd floor of a building on North Decatur Road. We named him Dashiell. That was her pick. She had it picked out at about 4 months, and she would not budge on it, and I thought it was a soft name for a boy, and I said so, and she told me I could pick the middle name. Dashiell Calder Ashworth. I never married again. People have asked me about that maybe 200 times over 34 years, and I have given about 200 different soft answers, and I am going to give the actual one exactly once and then move on. It was not grief. Grief was there for a long time, and then it was not the reason. The reason is that I was 30 years old with a newborn, and I made a decision in about the first year. And the decision was that I was not going to bring a woman into that house who might one day look at that boy and see somebody else's child. I know that is not fair. I know there are 10,000 good women who would have loved that child like their own, and I have met some of them. I could not risk it. I had one thing, and it did not have a mother, and I was not going to gamble it on a maybe. So it was the two of us for 18 years in a house on Kinsey Drive in Tucker, Georgia, that I bought in 1993 and that I still live in. I took him to work. That is how it went. From about age 4, he was in the passenger seat of a service van on Saturdays and in the summers, and there is a whole generation of plumbers in DeKalb County who taught my son something. Ozzie Pruitt Hale taught him to sweat copper when he was 9 years old. That man was 71, and he stood in my garage with a torch and a 9-year-old, and I have a photograph of it on the refrigerator right now. I did the school runs, I did the parent conferences. I sat in a gymnasium in 2003 at a thing where they honored the mothers, and I sat there because there was nowhere else to sit, and my son was 12, and he did not want me to leave, and I stayed. I did his laundry until he was 15, because I did not know when to stop. There are two things from those 18 years that I go back to. The first is the 4th grade thing about the mothers. There was an assignment where they wrote something about their mother and read it out loud, and the teacher called me, a woman named Delphine Rutkamp, and she said, "Mr. Ashworth, I can excuse him from this." And I said, "Let me ask him." And a 9-year-old sat at that kitchen table and said he wanted to do it. He wrote 4 sentences about a woman he had never met, out of 11 photographs and whatever I had told him, and he stood up in a classroom and read them. I did not go. I was not invited. It was a school day, and Delphine Rutkamp called me that afternoon to tell me he had done it and that he had done it well. I sat in a van in a parking lot in Chambly and could not get out for about 10 minutes. The second is Christmas of 2002. He was 11, and he had asked for a thing that cost about $400, and 2002 was a bad year. I had 2 crews and a receivable that went 90 days, and I did not pay myself in November. I bought it anyway. Of course I did, and I have thought since about whether that is the beginning of all of it, not the item. The fact that a boy asked for a $400 thing in a year his father did not take a paycheck, and got it, and never knew anything about November. And I paid for everything. His undergraduate degree at Georgia State, Business Administration, 4 years, cash. I wrote a check every semester for 4 years, and there is not $1 of debt attached to that degree. His MBA at Emory, which is not cheap, and which was 2016 through 2018, and which I paid for out of the business while I was still running it. The down payment on his condominium in Brookhaven in 2019, $91,000. He was 28, and then $1,100 a month toward that mortgage, from 2019 until this past October, because the payment was more than he could carry on what he was making, and I said I would help for a year. 6 years, not 1 year, 6. That is about $79,000 on top of the 91, and I do not want anybody to think I sat down and calculated that at the time, because I did not. I calculated it in November of last year, at a kitchen table, with a legal pad, and I have wished ever since that I had not. Dashiell is 34. He worked, for a commercial real estate development company in Buckhead called Trellis Cade Partners. Mixed-use developments mostly. Retail podium with residential above it, which is what has been going up all over the north side of this city for 15 years. He was a development manager. That is a real job with real responsibility, and he was, by every account I ever got, good at it. He ran the pre-construction side on 2 projects, and he knew his numbers. I was proud of that boy. I need somebody to understand that I was extremely proud of him, right up until a Thursday night in September, and that some part of me still is, and that both of those are true at the same time, and I have not been able to separate them. Here is the thing that made all of it possible, and I did not think about it for 6 years. Trellis Cade Partners has used Ashworth Mechanical as their primary mechanical subcontractor since 2019. That is not a coincidence, and it did not happen because we were cheap. In 2019, my son got that job, and he mentioned to me that his firm was unhappy with the mechanical contractor on a project in Chambly. And I said, "Tell them to call us." They called us. We bid it. We got it. And we got it honestly, and the work was good. And then for 6 years we kept it, and here is how. I told Ilya Bergstrom, who ran operations for me then and who runs it now, one sentence in 2019. I said, Trelliscade gets whatever they need. That is all I said. One sentence, in a hallway, and that man has run this business with me since 2001, and he understood exactly what it meant. What it meant, in practice, over 6 years. They got priority scheduling. When 2 jobs needed the same crew on the same Monday, Trelliscade got the crew. Every time, for 6 years, they got emergency response with no premium. We have a rate for after-hours call-outs, and it is substantial, and every other customer in this city pays it. They never paid it once. Not one time in 6 years, and there were probably 40 of those calls. They got change orders absorbed. This is the one that matters most, and it is the one nobody outside the trades understands. On every job, there are things that come up that were not in the drawings. A conflict, a field condition, an owner who changes their mind in month 4. Normally you price it, you submit it, and the general contractor and the owner fight about it for 6 weeks. We ate them. Anything under about $11,000, we just did it and did not bill it. Over 6 years, that is somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000 of work that Ashworth Mechanical performed and never invoiced. And they got payment terms nobody in this industry gets. Net 60, unenforced, which in practice meant net whenever. Not one word of that was in a contract. There is no document anywhere that says any of it. It was one sentence in a hallway in 2019 because my son worked there. Nobody at Trelliscade knew. That is the part that ended up mattering. Their people thought they had a good subcontractor who was easy to work with, and they had 6 years of that, and they had no idea that the reason was a man in a work shirt who owned 40% of the company. They did not know that, and neither, as far as I can tell, did my son. That is a thing I have gone back and forth on for a year, and the closest I can get is this. He knew we were his father's old company, and he knew we were good, and he did not spend 1 minute of his life wondering why the mechanical sub never gave anybody any trouble. He did not wonder. That is the theme of my son, and I did not see it for 34 years. Now the party. The 11th of September of last year, Trelliscade did a client appreciation event at a venue in West Midtown, one of those converted warehouse spaces with the exposed brick and the string lights, and there were about 60 people there. Clients, brokers, a couple of lenders, some of their own people. My son invited me. That surprised me. I need to describe how much that surprised me, because it is the reason I went. Dashiell had never invited me to a work thing in 6 years. Not once, and I had never asked, because I do not go to things. He called me on a Tuesday and said there was an event Thursday, and asked if I would come. I said to what? He said, it is a client thing, it will be boring, but you should come. And I said all right, and I hung up that phone and stood in my kitchen, and what I felt was pleased. I felt pleased in a way I would have been embarrassed to say out loud. I went and bought a shirt, 64 years old, and I went to a store on a Wednesday and bought a shirt. I got there at 7. He was already there, and he was in the middle of something, and he waved at me from across the room, and I got a beer and stood near a wall. I was there about 40 minutes before anybody spoke to me. That is not a complaint. That is a room full of people who work together, and I am a stranger in it, and I have been the stranger in rooms my whole life, and I do not mind it. At about 7:40, my son came over with a man in his 50s. That man is Wendell Coltrane, and he is a partner at Trelliscade, and he is my son's boss's boss, and he is the reason my son was at that party rather than at home. And here is what happened, and I have replayed it about 11,000 times. Wendell Coltrane put his hand out and said, "Hi, Wendell Coltrane." I said, "Calder Ashworth." And Coltrane said, "Ashworth," as in, and I said, "That is right." And my son said, "Oh, that is just the help. He did our HVAC." And he laughed. And he laughed. And Wendell Coltrane laughed, because a man laughs when the person next to him laughs, and 2 other people standing there laughed, and one of them said something I did not catch, and Coltrane said, "Well, thank you for keeping us cool," and shook my hand a second time and walked away. 11 seconds. Maybe 12. I laughed. That is the part I have to keep saying because it is the truth. I stood there and I laughed with them, and I said something about how it is a lot of building to cool, and my son slapped me on the shoulder and said he would find me later, and he went off after Coltrane. I stood by that wall for another 2 hours and 11 minutes. I have been asked why I did not leave, and the answer is that I did not have anywhere to be, and that it did not fully land for about 40 minutes. That is the thing about a sentence like that. It goes in and it sits there, and you keep drinking your beer, and then somewhere around 8:15, you are standing by a wall in a warehouse, and it opens up. I remember exactly where I was when it landed. There was a table with those little food things on it, and I was reaching for one, and my hand stopped, and I put it back. The help. He did our hafak. He did not say my father. He did not say Calder Ashworth. He did not say the man who built the company. You are standing in a building cooled by. He said, that is just the help. I want to tell you about the 2 hours, because the sentence was 11 seconds and the 2 hours is what actually did it. About 20 minutes after that, I was standing near a high table with 3 of my son's co-workers, and one of them asked him about business school. And Dashiell Ashworth said, Emory, and then he said, I put myself through, so it took me a minute. I put myself through. I paid $111,000 for that degree, out of a business I built with 2 vans. I wrote those checks personally. I remember the last one because it was in April of 2018 and it cleared on a Tuesday, and I looked at the balance afterward. He said, I put myself through, so it took me a minute. And the woman he said it to said, oh, that is impressive. And he said, yeah, it was a grind. I was 11 feet away holding a beer. I did not say anything then, and I have not said anything about it since, and I am never going to. And there is not one thing in this world that would make me correct that in front of people. But I stopped drinking the beer. Around 9 o'clock, there was a moment at a table where somebody was talking about a project in Chambly, and I said something. I said one sentence about the chilled water on that building, which I know about because my company put it in, and because I personally walked that mechanical room in 2020. And my son said, Dad. That is all he said. Dad, in a tone, the way you say it to somebody who has interrupted, and then he turned back to the person he was talking to and kept going. I have been spoken to like that maybe 4 times in my life, and never once by somebody I raised. I stood at that table for another minute or 2, and then I went and got a water. And then at about 9:40, in the parking lot, my son told me what the invitation was for. He walked me out. That was decent of him, and I noticed it, and I was glad about it, and I was standing at the door of my truck fishing for keys when he said, hey, so, one other thing. There is a permit problem on a project of theirs in Doraville. A mechanical rough-in inspection that failed twice, and the county inspector is a man named Berthold Nkemelu, who has been inspecting mechanical work in DeKalb County since about 1997. I have known Bert Nkemelu for 28 years. He came to my 60th birthday, and my son said, I know you know that guy. Is there any way you can call him? I stood in a parking lot in West Midtown at 9:40 at night, and I said, what is the failure? And he said, honestly, I do not know the specifics. It is a hangar spacing thing or something, but it has been 2 weeks, and it is holding up drywall on 4 floors. I said, if it failed twice, it failed for a reason, Dash. And he said, right, but you know how those guys are. Sometimes it is just about who is asking. I said, I will make a call. And my son said, thanks, Dad, you are the best. And he went back inside. I drove home to Tucker, 31 minutes, and I did not turn the radio on. Here is what I understood in that truck, and I understood all of it at once, and it did not take 31 minutes. It took about 4. He did not invite me to that party. He acquired me for that party. There was a thing he needed done in DeKalb County, and I was the tool for it, and the invitation was the handle, and the entire evening was a transaction that I had experienced as an act of affection. The next part is what actually did the damage. If he had introduced me correctly and then asked me for that favor, I would have made the call the next morning and never thought about it again. That is what a father does. That is not a grievance. He introduced me as the help, said he put himself through school, told me not to talk at a table, and then asked me for a favor in a parking lot. In that order. Inside of 2 hours. And the thing about the order is that it means he was not embarrassed by me in a moment of weakness. He had already decided what I was, days before, when he made the guest list, and then he handled me accordingly all night, and then he collected. I made the call. People always ask about that, so here it is. I called Bert Nkemelu on Friday morning at about 8, and I asked him what was going on at that project in Doraville, and Bert told me, and it was not a hangar spacing thing. It was that the mechanical contractor on that job, not us, a different outfit, because Trellis Cade had split that project, had installed condensate drains with no trap on 22 air handlers, which is not a technicality. That is a thing that puts water in a building. Bert said, Calder, they failed twice because they fixed 4 of them and called me back. And I said, all right, Bert, that is all I wanted to know. And he said, do you want me to do something? And I said, no, do exactly what you were going to do. I never told my son that. He thinks I made the call and it did not work. He said something about it in October, some remark about how the county is impossible, and I let him have it. Let me stop for a second here because we are coming up on the part that I have never laid out for anybody in one piece. If you are still here, subscribe. I put a new one of these up every single day. Hit the like button on your way past. And tell me this in the comments, because I have never worked it out. He asked me for that favor in a parking lot 90 minutes after calling me the help, and he did not see any contradiction in it. Is that a man being cruel, or is that a man who has genuinely never once thought about what I am? I read all of them. I did nothing for 11 days. Everybody assumes there was a plan in those 11 days. There was not one. There was a 64-year-old man in a house in Tucker not sleeping. I ate at the counter. I did that thing where you go to bed at 10 and get up at 1 and sit in a chair in the dark. On the second day, I called Ilya Bergstrom about something else entirely and could not do it. I got him on the phone and asked him a question about a job in Alpharetta, and he answered it. And then he said, Calder, you all right? And I said, I am fine. And Ilya Bergstrom, who has worked with me since 2001 and who does not ask personal questions, said, all right, and let it go. And I have always been grateful for that. On the 4th day, I got the legal pad out. That was not strategy either. That was a man doing arithmetic, because arithmetic is a thing you can do at 2 in the morning when you cannot do anything else. Georgia State, 4 years. Emory, 2 years. The condominium down payment. 6 years of $1,100 a month. $281,000 in change. I sat at a kitchen table in a house I bought in 1993 and looked at a number on a legal pad, and then I did the other column, which is the one that finished me. The other column was Trellis Cade. 6 years of priority scheduling. 6 years of no after-hours premium, which I put at about $140,000. 6 years of absorbed change orders, which Ilya later put at $461,000. 6 years of payment terms that cost us real money in carrying costs, somewhere north of $600,000. Not to my son, to his employer, to the company where 60 people laughed in a warehouse in West Midtown. I had been quietly subsidizing my son's firm for 6 years so that his life there would be easier, and not one person in that building knew it, including him, and the total was more than twice what I spent raising him. I sat there until about 4 in the morning. Everybody assumes rage. It was not rage. What I felt was stupid, not hurt, stupid, in the specific way a man feels stupid when he finds out he has been the only person at a table who did not know the rules. 6 years of a sentence in a hallway. $600,000 of work my crews did at 11 o'clock at night, and a director of construction at a firm in Buckhead who thought that was just what we were like, and a son who thought it was just how the world worked, and a father who arranged all of it and told nobody, and then stood by a wall in a warehouse and got called to help. That is not somebody doing something to me. That is a thing I built. I have not been able to put that down, and I do not think I am going to. And I did not decide to do anything that night. It would be a better account if I had, and I did not. What I decided that night was that I was going to stop. The board meets quarterly. The October meeting was on the 8th, in the office on Buford Highway, and there were 5 of us, and the chief financial officer, a woman named Delphine Ose Marchetti. We got through the ordinary things, and then there is a section at the end called Other Business. And I said, I want to talk about the Trellis Cade account. Persimmon Ives Barclay said, what about it? And I told them, all of it, in about 11 minutes. I told a board of directors that in 2019 I had verbally instructed operations to give one customer preferential treatment, that it had never been documented, that it had continued for 6 years, and that by my own rough estimate, it had cost the company somewhere north of $600,000 in unbilled work and unrecovered premium. You could hear that room. Delphine Ose Marchetti said, is any of that in the master service agreement? I said, no, there is a standard MSA. Everything I just described is outside it. And she said, so we have been performing outside the agreement, uncompensated, for 6 years. I said, correct. Persimmon asked me why I was raising it now, and I said, because I am the one who did it, and it needs to stop. and I am not going to have somebody find it in a diligence file in 3 years." She looked at me for a second. "That woman is not stupid. She has known since 2022 that my son works at Trellis Cade. It was in the disclosures when we did the transaction, because it had to be. She did not ask me anything about it. She has never asked me anything about it, to this day, and I have thought a great deal about that, and I have decided it was a professional courtesy, and I am grateful for it. What she said was, 'All right, what are you proposing?' And I said, 'I am proposing that we treat that account exactly the way we treat every other account, effective immediately, and that I recuse myself from the vote.' I recused myself. That is the single most important thing in this entire business, and it is the reason nobody could ever come back at me. I did not vote. It is in the minutes. Director Ashworth disclosed a familial relationship with an employee of the counterparty, made a recommendation, and recused himself from the vote. The other 4 voted unanimously to normalize the account. And what normalize means in practice is this: standard scheduling. Trellis Cade takes their place in the queue like every other customer, which on a good week is fine and on a bad week is 11 days. Standard after-hours rate. 1.5 times, which is in the MSA and always was. Change orders priced and submitted, all of them. Anything outside the scope of work gets a number on it and gets sent, which is what we do for every other general contractor in this state. Net 30, enforced. Not one thing in that list is a punishment. There is not a single line item in it that we do not apply to every other customer in a portfolio of about 90 accounts. That is the whole trick and deficiency. That is the only reason any of it worked. I did not raise a price. I did not slow anything down. I did not instruct anybody to do one thing to that company. I stopped doing them a favor that nobody had ever told them they were getting. Ilya Bergstrom sent the notice on the 14th of October. 2 paragraphs, professional, addressed to their director of construction, saying that effective November 1st we would be administering the agreement per its terms. Their director of construction wrote back 3 words, "Understood. Thanks, Ilya." He had no idea what he had just agreed to. How could he? He had been at that firm 4 years, and everything he had ever experienced from Ashworth Mechanical was the favor, and he thought the favor was just what we were like. There is a thing about that decision that I have to say, because otherwise I come out of this looking better than I am. 211 people work at that company. When I told that board about $600,000 of unbilled work, I was not only talking about my feelings. I was talking about margin on a business that pays 211 mortgages, and I had been quietly giving it away for 6 years to make one young man's job easier, and not one of those 211 people voted on that. Ilya Bergstrom knew and said nothing for 6 years because I signed his checks. So when people ask me whether October was revenge, the honest answer is that it was about 40% revenge and about 60% a man finally doing the thing he should have done in 2019, and I have never been able to get those 2 numbers apart, and I have stopped trying. The first thing they noticed was the change orders. November, 11 of them. Then in December, 19. Nothing improper. Every one of them legitimate. Every one of them documented. Every one of them a thing we would have billed any other customer for and had been eating for 6 years. About $140,000 in 2 months on a project in Sandy Springs that had been budgeted using 6 years of history that was not real. The second thing was the schedule. There was a Monday in December where a crew that would have gone to their Sandy Springs job went to a hospital retrofit in Marietta instead, because the hospital called first and there is a queue. That cost them 4 days. Then in January, it cost them 9. By the middle of February, that project was 6 weeks behind and 11% over on mechanical. And nobody at Trellis Cade could explain why. That is the part I did not fully anticipate. I expected them to be annoyed. What actually happened is that a firm went looking for a reason and could not find one, because there was no reason to find. Every invoice was correct. Every change order was justified. Every scheduling decision was defensible. They were not being punished. They were being treated normally, and they had no baseline for normal, and so it felt to them like something had gone wrong. Something had gone wrong. It had gone wrong on the 11th of September, in a warehouse in West Midtown, and there were 4 people who knew it, and none of them were at that firm. And my son was the account manager. Dashiell called me in January. He called me about the schedule. Sit with that for a second. My son called his father, whom he had introduced as the help in September, and had not seen since Thanksgiving. to ask him to lean on a mechanical contractor. He said, "Dad, are you still in touch with anybody over there?" I said, "Over where?" He said, "Ashworth. Whoever runs it now. Whoever runs it now." I said, "Some." And he said, "Because they have gotten really hard to work with since the fall, and I do not know what happened. Do you think you could make a call?" I said, "I do not think that would help." And he said, "Why not?" And I said, "Because a company is not a favor, dash." There was a pause on that phone, and then he said, "Okay, that is fair." And then he talked for 4 minutes about something else. And then he asked me whether I was still able to do the 1100 that month because things were tight. I said yes. I paid it in January. I paid it in February, and March too. The escalation meeting was on the 11th of March. Wendell Coltrane demanded it. Their mechanical costs were 11% over on 2 projects, and the Sandy Springs job was 6 weeks behind, and their director of construction could not explain it, and a partner at a development firm cannot explain it. So he asked for a meeting with ownership. Persimmon Ives Barclay called me on the 6th of March. She said, "Calder, Trellis Cade has asked for an ownership-level meeting on the 11th. I am going, and Delphine is going. Do you want to be in that room?" And here is the thing that people are not going to believe, and it is true. I said, "I do not know." I sat with that for 2 days, because there was a version of me that stayed home, and that version is probably the better man, and I have thought about him a great deal. I called her back on the 8th, and I said, "I will be there." And Persimmon Ives Barclay said one thing, and she said it carefully, and she is the only person in this entire business who ever said anything to me about it. She said, "Calder, if you come, I am not going to introduce you as anything other than what you are." I said, "I know." And she said, "All right then." The meeting was at Trellis Cade's office in Buckhead, on the 11th floor, in a conference room with glass on 2 sides. 11 o'clock in the morning. We came in at about 10:55. Persimmon, Delphine Ose Marchetti, Ilya Bergstrom, and me. There were 6 of them in that room. Wendell Coltrane, their director of construction, a man named Rutger Vance Lamott, a woman from their finance side, 2 project people, and my son. He was at that table because it was his account. He had to be there. Nobody put him in that room to be cruel and farject. There was no orchestration. He was the development manager on the Sandy Springs project, and there was a meeting about the Sandy Springs project. I walked in behind Persimmon. I saw my son see me. I have thought about those 2 seconds more than I have thought about any 2 seconds of my life, and I am going to tell you exactly what was on that young man's face, which was nothing. He did not understand. He thought, and he told me this later, in September, in my kitchen, he thought I had come as some kind of consultant. He thought Ashworth had brought the old founder along, because there was a technical question. He half stood up, and he said, "Dad?" And I said, "Dashel." And then I sat down at the head of that table. Not by choice. The seating is the whole thing. Persimmon Ives Barclay pulled out the chair at the end, and then she gestured at it, and said, "Calder." So the chief executive of that company gestured her founder into the head chair in front of a room of people, and I sat in it, and I put my hands on the table. Wendell Coltrane was looking at me. He knew me, and he could not place it. I watched a man do that. His mouth was slightly open, and he was doing the thing where you cycle through categories. Persimmon started the meeting. She said, "Before we get into the numbers, introductions. Persimmon Ives Barclay, Chief Executive. Delphine Ose Marchetti, Chief Financial Officer. Ilya Bergstrom, Vice President of Operations." And then she said, "And Calder Ashworth, who founded this company in 1994, and who sits on our board, and holds 40% of it." Nobody said anything for about 2 seconds. I was looking at the table. I did not look up. I looked at a spot on that conference table, about 11 inches from my hands, and I stayed there. And Wendell Coltrane said, "I am sorry, we have met." And I said, "We have. In September, at your event in West Midtown." And Coltrane said, "That is right." And there was a silence in that room that I would not wish on anybody, including my son, including that day. Rutger Vance Lamott, who had no idea what was happening, and who had done nothing wrong at any point in this, said, "All right, well, should we look at the change orders?" And we looked at the change orders for an hour and 10 minutes. That is the part nobody believes. There was no speech. Nobody said one word about a party. We went through 19 change orders line by line with a laptop and a screen, and Ilya Bergstrom explained the scope on each one, and Delphine explained the pricing, and Rutger Vanslamat agreed with about 17 of them and pushed back on 2, and we split the 2. It was a completely ordinary meeting. I said maybe 40 words in 70 minutes, and every one of them was about mechanical work. At about 11:50, Wendell Coltrane asked the question. He said, "Mr. Ashworth," and he said it to me, not to Persimmon. He said, "I have to ask. We have had 6 years with you people, and it has been the smoothest relationship in our portfolio. What changed in the fall?" Everybody at that table looked at me. And I said, "Nothing changed. You are being administered per the agreement." He said, "Meaning what?" And I said, "Meaning that for 6 years you were not." Coltrane said, "I do not follow." And Delphine Ose Marchetti, bless that woman because she did it for me, and she did it in the driest possible voice. Delphine said, "Prior to November, there were a number of concessions on this account that were not contractual. Scheduling priority, waived after-hours premium, absorbed change orders. Our board reviewed the account in October and determined it should be administered on the same terms as the rest of the portfolio." Wendell Coltrane said, "Who authorized the concessions?" And Delphine said, "They predate my tenure." That is not a lie. She joined in 2023. And then Wendell Coltrane looked at me, and I looked back at that man and I said, "I did. That is it. That is all I said, 2 words, and I did not explain them, and I have never explained them to anybody in that building." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "That is not relevant to this meeting." Nobody pushed it. In a room like that, at that level, when a man who owns 40% of the counterparty says a thing is not relevant, it stops being discussed. But it did not stop being thought about. I watched Wendell Coltrane sit in a chair on the 11th floor of a building in Buckhead and work backward through 6 years, and then work backward through one evening in September, and I watched him arrive. There was one more beat in that room, and it is the one I did not plan and could not have. After I said that is not relevant to this meeting, Rutger Vanslamat, the director of construction, the man who had written back, understood, thanks Ilya, in October, who had never done one thing wrong to anybody. Rutger said something. He said, "To nobody in particular, so we have been getting a discount for 6 years and nobody told us." And Persimmon Ives Barclay said, "You were getting a courtesy, it was never priced." And Rutger said, "Right, but our whole budget model," and then he stopped. Because he had just worked out, in front of 11 people, that 6 years of his firm's mechanical estimating history was built on a number that was never real, and that every project they had budgeted since 2019 had been budgeted wrong. That is not about my son. That is a real operational problem for a real firm, and they are still dealing with it. He looked at my son. He looked at Dashiell Ashworth, at that table, in a suit, and I watched the arithmetic complete on a man's face. My son was white. He had not said one word in an hour and 20 minutes. The meeting ended at about 12:15. We shook hands. I shook Wendell Coltrane's hand for the 3rd time in my life, and he held on for about a half-second longer than a man normally does. And he said, "Mr. Ashworth." And I said, "Mr. Coltrane." And then I walked out of that building with the chief executive of my own company and got in my truck. I sat in my truck in the parking deck of that building for about 20 minutes before I started it. Persimmon Ives Barclay knocked on the window on her way to her car. I put it down and she stood there for a second, and then she said, "That was a well-run meeting." And I said, "It was." And she said, "Calder, you did not have to be in that room." And I said, "I know." And she said, "I am glad you were." Then she said, "And if he calls me, I am going to be extremely polite to him, and I am not going to tell him one thing. She has never mentioned it again. She has never mentioned it again." Dashiell called me at 4 o'clock that afternoon. He was not angry. That is the thing that gets me. My son was frightened. He said, "Dad, what was that?" And I said, "That was a meeting about change orders." And he said, "You own 40%. I said, "Yes." He said, "Since when?" And I said, "Since 2022. It was in the transaction documents, Dash. It has been in a filing for 3 years. And he said, "How was I supposed to know that?" I did not answer him for a second. And then I said, "You could have asked me one time in 6 years how the company you send your work to was doing." He said, "That is not fair." And I said, "No, it is not. Almost nothing about this is fair." And then my son said the thing that made the rest of it easy. He said, "Dad, you have to fix this. Coltrane is going to think I have been running some kind of a thing. Not, what did I do? Not, I am sorry about September. You have to fix this, because of how it makes him look." I said, "I am not going to do that." And he said, "Dad," and I said, "Dashiell, I am going to go now." Nothing dramatic happened to my son at that firm. The version people expect is a firing scene, and there was not one. What happened is that the temperature changed. He came off the Sandy Springs project in April. That was framed as a resource decision. He was not in a client meeting in May that he had been in every month for 2 years. In June, they reorganized the development team, and he reported to somebody who used to be his peer. And in the middle of July, Wendell Coltrane had a conversation with him that my son has never described to me in any detail, and 11 days later he resigned. Resigned. That is what is on the paper, and that is what he says, and I am not going to call it anything else. He was out of that building on the 1st of August. There is one thing about that period I found out later, and it is the worst thing in this whole business. In May, my son told 2 people at that firm that he and I were estranged. He told them that we had not spoken in years, and that he had no relationship with Ashworth Mechanical or with its founder. That is not true. I paid his mortgage in May. We spoke on the telephone in April, and again in May. He said it because it was the only story that explained why he had not disclosed a conflict of interest for 6 years. And I understand exactly why he said it, and I would probably have said something too. But he stood in an office in Buckhead and told strangers that his father was not in his life, in a month that his father was paying $1,100 toward his home. I heard about that in November, from Ilya, who heard it from somebody at that firm, and I have not mentioned it to my son, and I am not going to. Here is what nobody talks about with a thing like this. Nobody said anything to him. Not one person at that firm ever said one word to my son about September, or about my father, or about 40%. That is what makes it unbearable. He spent 4.5 months in a building where 60 people had figured something out about him, and every single one of them was professional to his face, and he could not raise it because raising it means saying the sentence out loud. The same people who laughed at that joke in a warehouse spent the spring being extremely polite to him. He got another job in September, development coordinator at a smaller firm in Marietta. That is a step back. Coordinator is the job below manager, and he had that title in 2019. The money is significantly less. He told me the number in September, and I am not going to say it here, but it is about 60% of what he was making. He could not carry the condominium. He listed it in October, and it sold in December, and he did all right on it because Brookhaven has been Brookhaven for 6 years, and he cleared about $91,000, which is almost exactly the down payment I gave him in 2019. He is renting in Smyrna. I have not seen it, he has not invited me, and I have not asked. Renata. I do not have a Renata. That is the thing about an only child, and I have thought about it a great deal in the last year. There is nobody else. There is no daughter who sold a car. There is no second child who turned out different that I can point at and say, see, it was not the raising. There is one of him, and I made him, by myself, from a hospital hallway in 1991, and whatever he is, I did it. That is the part nobody in the comments is going to be able to fix for me. I stopped the $1,100 a month in October. The timing matters, and I have been asked about it. I did not stop it in March when he found out. I did not stop it in April or May or June or July or August. I paid it every single month, including the month he resigned, and I did not mention it, and he did not mention it. I stopped it on the 1st of October, 11 days after he came to my house. He came to my house on the 20th of September. That was the first time in my house since Thanksgiving of the previous year. He sat at the kitchen table where I did the arithmetic on the legal pad, and he had lost weight, and he did not look good, and he apologized. It was not nothing, and it also was not what I needed, and both of those are true. He said he was sorry about the party. He said he had said something stupid, and he had known it was stupid at the time and had not fixed it, and that he had been thinking about it every day since March. He said I was showing off in front of Coltrane, and I said the first thing that came into my head, and it was a terrible thing to say, and I am sorry. That is a real apology. That is a better apology than most people ever get, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. And then he said, and I know it cost me my job. And I said, dash. And he said, no, I get it. I am not blaming you, but I want to understand. Was that what that was? And I said, was what was? And he said, the change orders, the schedule. Was that because of what I said? I sat at that table with my son, and I told him the truth, and it took about 4 minutes. I told him about the sentence in the hallway in 2019. I told him about the 6 years, and the after-hours calls, and the absorbed change orders, and the $600,000. I told him about the board meeting in October, and about the fact that I recused myself from the vote. And I told him that I did not do one single thing to that firm except stop doing them a favor they never knew they were getting. He sat there for a while, and then Dashiell Ashworth said the thing that ended it for me. He said, so you did do it. That is what he took. Out of 4 minutes, that is what my son took. He did not say, you carried my employer for 6 years and I never knew and I never asked. He did not say, you spent $600,000 making my job easier. He said, so you did do it. And I said, no, son, I stopped doing it. And he said, Dad, that is a distinction that only works if you are the one holding the money. And you know what? That is the smartest thing that young man has ever said to me, and I have thought about it for 4 months, and there is something in it. There is something in it, and it is still not enough, because a man who has been carried for 6 years and never noticed does not get to explain to the man who carried him what a favor is. I said, I think you should go. And he said, are you serious? And I said, yes. He stood up and he said, so that is it? And I said, that is it for now. He has called 11 times since September. I have taken 4 of them. They are about nothing, and they are pleasant, and they are 11 minutes long, and neither of us mentions any of it. That is where it is. Now I have to tell you about Marisol's things, and then I am going to tell you what I actually think, and then I am done. There is a room in that house on Kinsey Drive that has her things in it. Not a shrine. Let me kill that idea before anybody has it. It is a spare bedroom with a closet in it, and in that closet there are 4 boxes, and I have not opened 3 of them since 1994. The 4th one has photographs. She was a dental hygienist. I have not said that yet, and it belongs in here. She worked at a practice on Lawrenceville Highway, and she was very good at it, and people asked for her, which is a thing that happens with hygienists, and which she was quietly proud of. She sang in the car and badly. She could not cook one thing and did not care. She read 4 books at a time and left them face down all over that house, and I found one under a chair in 1993, 2 years after, and I could not touch it for a week. She wanted 3 children. That is what I cannot get past when I am in that room. She wanted 3, and she said so, and she got 1, and she got him for 90 minutes, and never got to hold him because they had taken him out to me in a hallway. There are 11 photographs of that woman in existence that I know of. 11. She died in 1991, and there were no telephones with cameras in them, and she did not like having her picture taken, and 11 is what there is. Dashiell has seen all of them. I made sure of that. When he was about 7, I sat him down at that same kitchen table and went through every single one and told him who was in it, and where it was, and what she was like that day. I did that maybe 4 times over the years, and the last time was when he was about 16, and after that he stopped asking, and I stopped offering, which is what happens. Here is the thing I found out in 2021 and did not say anything about for 4 years. I was at his condominium in Brookhaven, 2nd or 3rd time I had been there. He had it professionally decorated, an actual decorator, a woman he paid, and it looked like something out of a magazine, and I told him so, and I meant it. And I was standing in that living room and I looked around it. There is not one photograph of a person in that condominium. Not one. Not me, not his mother, not a grandparent, not a friend. There is art on the walls. There is a large photograph of a bridge somewhere in Europe that he has never been to, and there is something abstract in a frame above the sofa, and there is not one human face in 1,100 square feet. I said something about it, once. I said, you ought to put some pictures up. And my son said, yeah, I have been meaning to find some frames that work. Frames that work. There are 11 photographs in existence of the woman who died in a hospital in Decatur in 1991, giving birth to that young man, and her son could not find frames that worked. I did not say another word about it. I have been in that condominium 4 more times since, and I never mentioned it again, and it sold in December, and I have no idea where those photographs are, or if he has them, and I am not going to ask, because if the answer is bad, I do not want it. That is the thing I would like people to understand about all of it. The party is not the story. I know that is what the story looks like from outside, and it is what everybody focuses on, and it is one sentence in 11 seconds in a room with string lights. The story is 34 years of a young man who never once asked. He never asked how his mother died, not once, past about age 12. He knows the word embolism, and he has never asked me what that day was. He never asked why I did not remarry. Never. 34 years, and that man has never asked me one question about my own life on that subject, and I have an answer ready, and I have had it ready since about 1996. He never asked how the tuition got paid. He said he put himself through, to a woman at a party, at 33 years old, and I do not think he was lying to her. I think he had genuinely reorganized it in his head, over 11 years, into a thing he did. He never asked how the company was doing. His work went there for 6 years. He never asked whether the $1,100 a month was a strain, and there were months in 2020 when it was. He never asked. And every single one of those is small, and none of them is cruelty, and you cannot point at any one of them. But you put 34 years of them in a stack, and what you have got is a man who has never once considered that his father is a person with a life in him. And so when he stood in a warehouse in West Midtown with his boss in front of him, and he had about 1 second to decide what I was, the thing that came out was the help, and it came out easily, and it came out first, and there was nothing underneath it stopping it. That is not a man who insulted his father. That is a man who did not have anything else in there. Here is what I would leave you with, and then I am going to shut up. I raised that boy by myself, from a hospital hallway. I did his laundry until he was 15. I paid $281,000 for his education and his home, and I subsidized his employer for 6 years to the tune of $600,000 more, and I did every bit of that quietly, and I never sent him a bill, and I never once said any of it out loud. And I have come to think that is the mistake, and it is entirely mine. I thought that keeping quiet about what you do for somebody is the highest form of it. That is what I was raised on. My daddy never told me what anything cost, and neither did Ozzie Pruitt Hale. But a child cannot be grateful for a thing he does not know happened, and a man cannot respect a father he has never seen carry anything, because I carried all of it out of his sight, on purpose, for 34 years, and then I stood in a warehouse and found out what I looked like to him with all of that hidden. I looked like the help. He was not wrong about what he could see. I made absolutely sure there was nothing to see. So if there is a man listening to this with a young child and some money, here is the only thing I have got. And it is not advice, it is a warning. There is a man I have to mention before I say the last thing, because he is the only person in this who did it right. Ozzie Pruitt Hale hired me in 1980, at 19 years old, for $4 an hour, and he told me, on about the second day, exactly what he was doing. He said, "Ashworth, I am going to teach you a trade, and it is going to take 4 years, and you are going to be worth about 11 times what I am paying you by the end of it, and I am telling you that now, so that in 1984 you do not think you did it by yourself." That man told a 19-year-old what he was getting, out loud, on the second day. He died in 2016, and I gave the eulogy, and I said that in it, and about 40 plumbers in a church in Scottsdale laughed because every one of them had heard some version of that speech. I never did it, 44 years, and I never once did the thing that man did for me on the second day. Tell them what it costs, not to collect, not to hold it over them. Tell them the number, once, when they are old enough, and let them carry the weight of knowing it. Because if you do not, you are not raising a grateful person. You are raising somebody who thinks the world is like that, and one day he is going to be 34 years old at a party, and the man who paid for all of it is going to be standing 11 feet away with a beer he is not drinking. The house on Kinsey Drive is in a trust now. I did that in November. It does not go to my son. It goes to a scholarship fund at the Technical College in Clarkston for the Mechanical Trades program, in my wife's name, the Marisol Ashworth Fund. It pays tools and tuition for 11 students a year. I told my attorney I wanted it to be for the kind of 19-year-old that Ozzie Pruitt Hale hired in 1980 for $4 an hour, and she wrote that down and put it in the letter of intent, and it is in there. I still have 40% of that company, and I still go in twice a month, and park in the lot and wear a work shirt. Persimmon Ives Barclay has never once mentioned September or March to me, not one word in a year. And in June she put me on the compensation committee, which I did not ask for. Ilya Bergstrom knows all of it. He has known since October. He has never said anything either, except one time in the parking lot in April, when he said, Calder, for what it is worth, we should have been billing them the whole time. Bert Nikemelu still inspects mechanical work in DeKalb County, and he still does not know why I called him that Friday morning. And there are 11 photographs of a woman in a box in a closet in a house in Tucker, Georgia, and I look at them about 4 times a year, and I am the only person left who knows what she sounded like. If you got something out of this one, subscribe before you go. That is the one that actually matters. I put a new story up every single day, and the next one is already written. Hit like on the way out. It genuinely helps this reach the people it is for. And in the comments, tell me the honest thing, not the kind one. He said it was a distinction that only works if you are the one holding the money. Was he right? I read every single one of them. I will see you in the next one.